Let me ask you something. Why do we have leaders? I mean, seriously, think about it. In any group, from a school project to, well, an entire country, someone always ends up in charge. Why is that?
And, building on that, who gets to make the rules? The rules we all have to live by. How do they get made? Are they even fair? These aren't just some big philosophical questions, right? They literally shape every single day of our lives.
So that's what this is all about. We're diving into the answers with what I like to call a user's guide to power. We're talking about political science.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to nail down what political science even is. Then, we'll get into a pretty interesting debate. Is it an art or a science? After that, we'll map out just how big this field is. And finally, we'll tie it all together and see why any of this actually matters in your day-to-day life. Okay, first things first, let's define this thing. I know. Political science can sound super intimidating, kind of academic and dry. But trust me, by the end of this part, you're going to see it's actually a really practical tool you can use to make sense of the world.
So if we're going by the book, what is it? Well, political science is basically the systematic study of the state, government, and politics. It's all about looking at the distribution of power and resources. Really, it's just trying to answer the how and the why behind everything happening in the political world.
But you know what? Forget the textbook definition for a second. If you want one that really sticks, you gotta hear this classic from Harold Loswell. He nailed it. He said politics is simply who gets what, when, and how. Boom, that's it. It's the struggle, right? The struggle for resources, for status, for influence. It's so simple, so powerful, and it's just so true.
So, here's the big takeaway from all this. I really want you to think of political science as a toolkit. Seriously, it's not some dusty old subject you have to memorize. It's a set of tools, concepts, frameworks that let you open up the hood on the news, figure out what's really going on in an election, and make sense of these huge global events.
All right, so we've got a handle on what it is. But this brings up a really big question, one that people in the field debate all the time. Is political science, actually a science?
Let's think about this for a second. In a natural science like chemistry, right? You can do controlled experiments in a lab. You've got these universal laws that always work. But political science, we're studying people. And people, well, we're messy, we're unpredictable. You can't just put an entire country into a test tube and see what happens. So instead, what do? We have to use different tools, like case studies and comparing different countries to try and spot the patterns and trends.
And that's the key, right there. It's a social science. It takes all the seriousness and the rigorous methods of science and applies them to finding patterns in our incredibly complex human world. And honestly, that's both its biggest challenge and its greatest strength. It doesn't run away from the messiness of human beings. It dives right into it.
Okay, which brings us perfectly to our next big topic, the scope of the field. I mean, if political science is this huge study of human power, what does it actually cover? Let's try and map out this entire political universe.
So you can basically break the whole thing down into 4 major areas, or subfields. A good way to think about them is like different continents on the map of politics. You've got political theory, comparative politics, international relations, and public policy.
So what are these? Well, political theory is all about the big why questions. What is justice? What are rights? Then you have comparative politics, which is exactly what it sounds like, comparing different countries to see what works and what doesn't. International relations, that's the global stage, how countries deal with each other, from trade all the way to war. And finally, public policy gets into the nitty-gritty of how governments actually try to solve problems. But here's the most important part. These aren't separate, isolated boxes. They all overlap. Think about a global trade war. To really get what's going on, you've got to use a little bit of each of these 4 lenses.
All right, so we've defined political science. We've talked about what kind of study it is. We've even mapped out its different parts. Which brings us to the biggest question of all, the one that really counts. Why should you care? Why does any of this matter? This is where we get to the good stuff, how you can turn all this knowledge into your very own toolkit for living a more informed life.
So what's actually in this toolkit for you? Well, for starters, you get the ability to actually decode the news, to see past the crazy headlines and understand the real forces moving things around. Second, it gives you what you need to make genuinely informed decisions, not just as a voter, but as a citizen. And third, it gives you a much deeper, richer understanding of the world we're all living in. Look, at the end of the day, the goal here isn't just to cram more facts into your head. It's about being more. Understanding this stuff truly empowers you.
It helps you make the shift from just being a passive observer, watching the world go by, to becoming an active, engaged, and informed citizen, someone who can actually participate in a meaningful way.
Because here's the thing. Politics isn't just something that happens to us. It's the story of our shared lives, a story that we are all writing together right now. So the only real question is, now that you've got the tools, who are you going to empower to write that next chapter?